Hey, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri Appellate Attorney, the guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today, we're going to take a look at your comments on the thought experiment video and see what everybody thought. And I'll have a few things to say. Mostly the comments were all very good and I thought very thoughtful. Some of you really went above and beyond. So with that said, let's turn to the comments. So here's the first one, and I'm sort of going in reverse order here, basically to keep these popping up in a way that makes sense. Here's an interesting, if silly, amendment to consider, an amendment that authorizes America having a king, the first of the line being chosen by Congress or a constitutional convention type body. Subsequent monarchs inherit the job, as is standard in monarchy. What's fascinating about the above is that powers are already taken. The executive branch is occupied by the president. Congress passes the law. Supreme Court is the decider. So what's left for the king to do? By custom, the monarch is the head of state and commander-in-chief, but that slot's taken by the elected president, so he'd just really be no more than an honorary colonel writ large, and he's right about that. So what the amendment would do, that would contradict the no title of nobility part of the Constitution, is create a monarch that is a pure figurehead. Maybe some influence, but no power. This hypothetical amendment, which would contradict Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 of the real Constitution, would in fact wind up being a nugatory, and it would be statecraft's answer to an outboard motor stuck on a tailgate of a pickup truck. Okay, of all of the metaphors that I've seen people come up with, that one is outstanding. And it's also an interesting thought experiment. I think for the most part, the founders just sort of didn't like the whole idea of having a king that became king simply by virtue of being born to the right person. So I think it's, again, sort of an interesting take on how this all works. And again, a thoughtful addition to the dialogue that we have in the thought experiment. So I want to thank DM Ryan 8355 for that comment. I thought it was really very good. So my pal Ken DeBusk says, if your hypothetical amendment followed the rules extant in the current Constitution, it would be superseding in Constitution, and even the SCOTUS could do nothing about it. However, it's so extremely limited, and I'm a boogeyman. I therefore burned my membership card and joined the bogeymen. Problem solved. And, you know, he's right. And I think that's one of the reasons why I set it up the way that I did. Because realistically, when it's like whack-a-mole, you know, whenever you set up to fix a problem, particularly with a governing document like the Constitution, you inevitably create 9 more problems that you never thought of. It's the law of unintended consequences, and it happens. So Stephanie Miller says you can make an amendment first that says later amendments control, and then an amendment to delete or add this language to the earlier amendments. Otherwise, what is the power to amend? It would be a useless power. Well, the bottom line is that if you follow the rules and you amend the Constitution according to the constitutional principles, then the Constitution is amended. That's how it works. So the fact that it's internally inconsistent or that it targets a group of individuals is, to a certain extent, just an artifact in another one of those whack-a-mole situations. So Gary Shanklin says the amendment would be constitutional, and I agree. Only one type of amendment, denying states equal representation in the Senate, is forbidden, so anything else is fair game. I think the amendment would be both fairly ineffective and highly corrosive to civil society. Now, a lot of people have made this comment that, yeah, it's constitutional, but look, it's just really bad policy. It's ineffective because, as someone else said, you know, they just redefine themselves. And it's also ineffective for other reasons because all it does is pit one group of people against another, which is never going to solve anybody's problem at all. This is Gunnar Bear 8659, and he says, by the letter of the law, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution cannot be unconstitutional. One impact that has, if we were ever to have a 28th Amendment, we give a lot of people who can abuse that power carte blanche to abuse it. You don't even have to extend that list with future amendments to include others that the government might want to lump in with the boogeyman. You only have to label someone a boogeyman and convince a court they're a boogeyman. Or more likely, torture that person into confessing they're a boogeyman, then turn around and say, even if my actions against this person would normally be considered cruel and unusual, their rights have been suspended all along, so what I did was constitutional. Okay, I have to be honest with you, I did not see that coming. I was thinking more along the lines of the First Amendment here, but that's an outstanding argument, and it is exactly the kind of argument that a tyrant would make. Think about that. That's exactly what a tyrant would say. We don't even have that amendment now, and we still have a lot of people in law enforcement abusing their powers. This is a very thoughtful comment. I think he did a really good job here. And then he says, I like this too, forget the baby with the bathwater. This chucks out the whole tub. And again, I agree. It's bad policy and it's a bad idea. But a lot of what I set up here was designed to give you the idea that responding to crises with instantly passed amendments or laws is a bad idea. You only have to look no further than the Patriot Act, what a terribly named act that was, to determine that giving the government enlarged powers in time of crisis is a bad policy decision. You know, we have a huge issue in this country with racism anyway. And during World War II, we interned all the Japanese Americans we could find. If you had a little bit of slant to your eyes, you were thrown in a camp. And it didn't matter whether you were Chinese or Japanese. If you looked different, you were thrown in a camp. And that kind of thing we can never allow to have happen again. And it came fairly close with 9/11. So doing this on 9/11, as I planned, hard to believe that I plan much of anything, but I do sometimes. Having this on 9/11 is designed to illustrate the folly of reacting with statutes that are governed by the proposition that this is going to fix, it's going to close the barn door now that the horse is out. So hopefully that shows up. And I agree with pretty much everything he says here. And then Lord Martia, I'm not sure this would be constitutional or not, but I believe it would establish a dangerous precedent. Absolutely right. A viable and humane alternative, I believe, would be to disenfranchise those guilty of horrific crimes and conspiracy to commit them until they have served their punishment. But of course now the Fifth Circuit has recently released an opinion that says the lifetime disenfranchisement of felons is unconstitutional. I think that's going to be taken up by the Supreme Court and reversed, but I throw that out there. And yeah, I'm planning on doing a video on that particular decision too. And offer much reduced punishments to those who demonstrate repentance, and none at all to those who have been forced to join the group, recognizing they aren't evil, and on a more pragmatic side, preparing the ground for defectors that could help destroy the threat. Basically allowing people to turn state's evidence, which makes some sense in this particular instance. Here's Buck. I think it would be constitutional, and again, I agree. There's nothing in the Constitution indicating the first 10 amendments had any more force than any other amendment, and that's true. So just as the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, newer amendments always supersede prior amendments they conflict with. And again, that's a good call. That's somebody who reads very carefully, and I applaud him. If the boogeymen were actually as threatening to our way of life as you describe, I suddenly don't feel sure about my convictions. If it really is true that most communities in El Salvador were being run by criminal gangs with police helpless to oppose them, and those communities were really liberated by Bukel's policies, I begin to question my commitment to our system necessarily being applied to all countries regardless of conditions. And there he's referring to what went on in El Salvador, how they cleaned up their country by basically putting about 90% of the MS-13 gang in long dark holes with bars around them. So for these reasons, I think your questions are extremely important and difficult. Dersh, as in Dershowitz, Alan Dershowitz, believes we should amend the Constitution to repeal the Second Amendment. I completely disagree for one reason. For possibly almost half the country, the Second Amendment is the only reason they're committed to the Constitution at all. You hear them extolling the central importance of the Constitution. What they're actually thinking is the Second Amendment. I don't know if that's accurate. I think most of us who extol the virtues of the Second Amendment also believe that it's there to protect the First. The Second Amendment is there as the bodyguard to the First Amendment, and it's also the answer to the Fourth and Fifth Amendments when the government goes off the rails. So I don't know that that's necessarily correct, Buck, but I appreciate you advocating in the way that you did, in a clear and articulate manner like that. Thank you very much for that. Now, Steve W. here says an alternative idea would be to legislate that specific amendments no longer applied to any citizens convicted of one or more of a small number of highly tightly specified crimes or of conspiracy in such a crime. The problem with that is that constitutions trump statutes. And then Yurchik says, the 13th Amendment already says slavery is legal in the U.S. as punishment for a crime, so that tracks. An amendment excluding felons from protection of other amendments is theoretically perfectly fine, an amendment, but not a statute. It's a really, really bad idea, but you could do it, and I don't think it would cause constitutional issues. And again, I tend to agree with that. I think it would just be terrible policy. Cora Jean says, sounds like a bait and switch, a political sleight of hand. If the court gets packed with delusional boogeymen who are young, the U.S. would cease to be fundamentally the U.S. for potentially a few generations. So a constitutional amendment cannot be unconstitutional. However, in the ever-growing dysfunctional state of the world we now live in, dystopia is becoming the norm. And since right is increasingly wrong and wrong is increasingly right, though it cannot be unconstitutional, it may certainly become so. Again, I think that's correct. So, again, all of these comments have just been exceedingly prescient, and they give me hope. As an attorney, they give me hope because essentially what you all are saying is, hey, we're paying attention. We understand what the law does, and we understand what the Constitution does, and we're with it. And again, that gives me hope for the future. The amendment which repealed other amendments would be constitutional, even though it would be destructive of our civil society. Again, agree. And then Eric says the thing that comes to mind to me is that newborn boys are left out of the protections of the 14th Amendment. And then he makes reference to the litigation to protect all children from mutilation. Feel free to look at that video and feel free to offer comments there and here if you would like. And then Donna Pizzo says, pretty sure the bar to get a new amendment is so high I find it difficult to even impossible to believe such an amendment could ever pass. Well, that's true. But you have to realize that when they were throwing Japanese people into prison camps during World War II, nobody stood up and said, hey, look, all Japanese Americans can't be bad. Why are we doing this? Why are we not looking for the spies? In many respects, it's very much like what happened with the pandemic, where we essentially locked down the well people and not the sick people. It's okay to lock down the sick people. That's how quarantines work. But at any rate, I think it's an interesting view on this, and I would hope that something like this couldn't pass, but who knows? And then Gary Shanklin says, don't count on it. If the attack was bad enough and fear and anger and emotion carried the day, such an amendment could be enacted fairly quickly. After September 11th, it took only 6 weeks to pass the Patriot Act. And he makes my point. It passed by a margin of 357 to 68 in the House and 98 to 1 in the Senate. That's a constitutional amendment 2/3 of the way done. The 26th Amendment, reducing voting age to 18, only took about 15 weeks to be ratified by the states after being proposed by Congress. So if the need is seen as great and or emotions run high, it could indeed be something that would be passed. And then Frosted Mini Firecracker, I love that name. Thanks, I think. Here I was in Tuscaloosa making breakfast, prepping for a big noisy game, and wham, now you're politely requesting I think about something complex. I love it though, so thank you. Well, I do what I can. This gentleman who commented earlier, Yurichik, I think is how I... Okay, you guys, if I've screwed up your pronunciation, you're going to have to give me some help here. You know, maybe in parentheses, this is how you pronounce my screen name. It would be helpful. I am, hooked on phonics didn't work for me. What can I say? The Constitution has already been applied differently to different groups of people. Slaves did not have access to the protections of the Bill of Rights, so it's arguably anticipated in the Constitution itself that the Constitution will only apply to some people. The 14th Amendment theoretically closed this loophole, though, and would be one of the grounds for the Boogeyman Amendment to be facially unconstitutional, but more in a minute on that and why I think it's a non-starter argument. Such an amendment would be trivially ineffective. Again, I agree, and it goes through all of the things we've already talked about here a little bit. What exactly does it mean for an amendment to exist? If we can imagine the Constitution as a single scroll of paper, the amendments are basically just additions at the bottom of the original text. You could amend the Constitution to do more directly alter the wording, as is often done with statutes, but to my knowledge, most U.S. constitutional amendments don't do this, they just add text. So in theory, if we're supposed to read the Constitution in order, the Boogeyman Amendment would be constitutionally valid in the sense that the First Amendment, First, etc. amendments provided certain rights. The 14th says the rights must be applied equally. Then the Boogeyman says, except in this case. That isn't incoherent when read that way, if we assume the current Constitution is the original plus all past amendments. And again, he's right. And then finally, he says there's no prohibition in the law or Constitution which says the amendment must avoid being facially unconstitutional. It would make no sense to do this, as then amending the Constitution would be effectively impossible, a point someone else, I believe, tried to make. In short, I think it's bad policy, it's ineffective, and I also think it does not cause constitutional issues. And he's right on all those things. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us precisely where we began, with hopefully the thought that this is just a thought experiment, and that hopefully we don't have anything that would cause such kind of knee-jerk reaction, and that hopefully we've learned our lesson in the days and months and years following the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was a disastrously bad piece of legislation. Anything that gave us the TSA is a disastrously bad piece of legislation. And I'm not throwing stones at the people who work in the TSA, but honestly, if you want to understand how to keep airplanes safe, you look at the way they do it in Israel and the way they do it in England, where they go out there and they ask people questions. What are you doing? They look for people who get nervous when they're under scrutiny. They have a very effective way of keeping their folks safe. So that's my thought on the matter. And I would also point out that I think everybody who made a comment in this case has done a fabulous job of explaining their thoughts. I wish I had time to read through all of them in depth and discuss them all in depth, but I've been criticized on here for going too long. So hopefully I haven't gone too long here. Thank you very much for all you guys who contributed, and I look forward to hearing comments from other folks on other topics that we discuss on this channel. The time is fast approaching when we're going to be setting pumpkins out on our porch with all kinds of designs carved into them. Fall is definitely approaching, and I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are too. If you have the opportunity today, please do something nice for someone. Make everybody's world better. Have a terrific day. Catch me down here at the beach next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.